Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the Guild Wars 2 Noob Guide. This episode we're going to talk about something that I think is actually really important to the game. It's not so much to do with statistics or anything like we were talking about before, and it doesn't actually have to do with your build, it's more involving tactics. And I'm not talking about the warrior trait line, but I think this is really interesting and a very important part of the game. We're talking about key binding, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a few of my really important keybinds, and I'm going to talk about them, the more important ones, and we'll get into it. So, as you can see, I'm playing my Necromancer right now. I never ever play my Necromancer, so you might say, oh crap, that's a horrible build, but that's because I have no idea how to play Necromancer, so just kind of ignore that. I want to right away thank you, Shem, for being my first patron. If you want to support me as a patron, then you can find a link to my Patreon down in the description below. And also feel free to leave a like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video and you want to see more. But anyway, so getting on to it. So, look, we're cracking our knuckles, okay? And so right away, let's get into it. So this is how you actually access your keybinds. So first of all, you could press F11, which is what I do, or you can click this gear in the top left and then click options, or you can press escape and then click options, okay? 3 ways. So, and then you go to the tab on the left that says control options, and we're going to be talking about this. We're not going to go through this entire list, but we are going to cover what I believe are the most important ones. So first of all, we've got movement, and of course it's kind of standard to use the WASD for movement, and that's kind of like the same for me, but there are people that use ESDF for movement so that it frees up some keys around the movement keys, and you can absolutely do that, but the way that I'm playing, I don't do that, so just keep in mind you're on your own if that's what you want to do, okay? And I found a setup that works pretty well for me, so we are going to talk about that. So you might be able to see that my strafe left and straight right are not bound. They don't actually have a primary binding. They are bound technically to the left and right arrow, but when do you ever use the arrow keys? Because your right hand is on the mouse, it's not on the arrow keys. So they are not bound, and they used to be bound. This is kind of like a fatal mistake for me. They used to be bound to Q and E, and I kept feeling like I was going to need them at some point, but the truth is, you don't need to bind strafing to a key. The reason why is that if you need to strafe, all you need to do is hold right click and then use the turn left or turn right. I'm using A and D right now, and that still accomplishes the strafe. You do not need to have a key. So, and same thing would happen if I was doing this. If I was doing the left and right arrow keys, see strafing like that, same thing there when I use A and D. Okay, so you do not need to keybind the strafe. That's number one. Number two is we're going to talk about dodge, all right? Dodge, I have bound to 2 keys, actually, and the primary one is V. Now, listen, you could use double tap to dodge. I've turned that off because occasionally I accidentally just like start running and then start running again or something like that. I don't want to accidentally dodge. Dodging is something you definitely do not want to accidentally do. You want every single dodge you do to be absolutely deliberate. Okay, so I have it actually bound to 2 keys for a reason. The reason why it's V for me, I think it's actually the default. Let me see, what is it? It is the default. V is the default. It's a good key because it's not too out of the way. It's very easy to reach, but it's not at a point where you're going to actually accidentally press it. Again, you do not want to accidentally dodge, okay? So again, you could double tap to dodge. You can use that. Some people like to do that. But I don't do it. I find it much more convenient to actually have a button bound to dodge. That being said, do not, okay, this is a serious noob move, okay? This is a noob guide. Do not do this. Do not make the noob mistake of clicking on your endurance bar to dodge. Do not do that. That is worse than clicking on your skills, which, by the way, I used to do too. So I've never clicked the endurance bar as a primary means of dodging, okay? I just noticed that you can do it. Never, ever do that. That's the noobiest move, and you will be an insanely newbie nooblet if you do that. So, don't do that. Bind a key or do double tap, okay? And I have it bound to V and B because sometimes my finger is not exactly in the right place. Sometimes I accidentally press B instead, and you want to actually dodge when you're intending to dodge. So you don't want to accidentally press B and be like, oh crap, what key am I actually touching? And then you have to look down at your keyboard, and then your character dies because you couldn't actually see an attack that was coming, or you couldn't get out of an AoE thing that is going. So I have it bound to V and B both. So if I accidentally press B, it's still going to dodge. Okay. So next is auto run. You do not need to bind auto run, but I have, because it makes it very convenient. I could just kind of like no hands it, right? I could just steer every now and then I'm running, and it's pretty easy to do that. Okay. But you do not need to. If you want to use R for like a skill, or if you want to use it for like interact or something like that, then you can. But for convenience, R works because it's R for run. It just works. Another thing you do not need to bind is walk. This is definitely like a roleplay thing. It just kind of makes it so that you can kind of walk with the NPCs, and you don't. I think you go a tiny bit faster than them, but it's nowhere near as fast as if you run. You definitely, if you want to bind this for roleplay purposes, you want to make sure that you're binding it to a key that is very out of the way. You do not want to accidentally press walk, which I've done before when I used to have it bound to like C. And you don't want to accidentally press it, and then you're walking around the battlefield and wondering why you're moving so slowly when you're just walking. And you're like, what kind of speed impairing debuff do I have on me when you're actually just walking and there's nothing on you? So put it very out of the way if you bind it. That's why it's L. It's all the way across the keyboard from my movement keys. Next we got jump and swim up. Space, it's just kind of a no-brainer. Space is something that you can reach very easily, and it's just something that you're going to want to be able to press very easily and very conveniently. So I've got it bound to space. And I'm actually going to change maps right now because I'm kind of feeling like it's giving me a little bit of frame rate lag. I don't know. But next we're going to talk about, oh, look at this. I can still keep up the window. Next we're going to talk about these skills, okay? So these two, swim down and about face, don't really worry about those. You could bind those on your own time if you have any free keys or something like that. But next we're going to talk about the skills. So the first one that I want to talk about is to swap weapons. I really feel like the tilde works for this because with the tilde, it's right next to your skill bar here, and it's right next to 1 on your keyboard as well. So it just kind of makes sense. It's just like, I don't know, it feels like it just makes the most sense. So, and there's nothing else that you would really want to bind for that action. No other key that makes more sense. So if you are using a class that swaps weapons, such as Necromancer, or in my case many times Warrior, then yeah, it's a good one to have. Okay, and the next 1 through 5 work really well for your weapon skills. It's pretty easy to reach them if you're using WASD. And also if you're using ESDF. If you're using ESDF, then it is still easy to reach 1 through 5. Okay, and actually 6 as well. But where it gets complicated is the healing skill, the utility skills, and the elite skills. See, I used to make the really super newbie mistake of having just my skills be bound to 1 through 0 on the keyboard, and it was just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for my weapons, and then 6, 7, 8, 9, 0 for the other part of my skill bar. It sort of makes sense visually, but the problem is that you can't actually reach the second half of those skills easily unless you're taking your fingers off of your movement keys, and so it becomes very, very very difficult and very cumbersome to actually activate those skills. And so many times what I would do is I would just simply click on the skills. I know, I was insanely newbie, but I used to actually do that, and that's actually a better way than binding it to the second part of the keyboard. But finally, I was able to see the error of my ways, and I thought maybe it would be better if I could just press the keys to activate these skills instead of having to click on them, or instead of having to reach my hand all the way across the keyboard. And so I did. So the healing skill I have bound at Z, and that works so well, actually, because what you could do is you could just simply be running around like this with the middle finger on W and the index finger on D, and then use your ring finger to activate Z, and you end up healing. and that's pretty useful. Pretty good skill, or sorry, pretty good key binding, because it's, I used to have it bound to Q, but Q is easier to accidentally press, and you don't want to accidentally use your heal skill. If you're at really high health, then you don't want to use your heal skill, because then it's on cooldown, especially for something that has a passive effect like Signet of Vampirism or Healing Signet on the warrior. You don't want to activate that for no reason, and then you're sacrificing the passive effect for no reason, right? Sometimes you're on a warrior and you activate Healing Signet when you actually need the healing, and then you just heal for a tiny amount, and you have resistance. Maybe even you don't even have any conditions on you, or you have something that just lasts for a long time, like a 1-second bleed or something, and then it's not even useful. So you end up actually really needing to not activate those skills at certain times. And so Z is a perfect position where it's easy to reach, but it's not too easy to reach where you're going to accidentally activate it. So that being said, next I have X and C for the first utility skills. These kind of just made sense because they're right next to Z. So I can easily just say, okay, X to use that, and that is just going to, activate that, and then C to use the next one, and right? It's just very convenient to use. Again, it's not easy to accidentally press those, so you don't really need to worry too much about that. For the third one, I do have Q, and you could say, well, it doesn't really make sense visually on the keyboard. How am I going to remember this? It really would benefit you a lot. It would behoove you to memorize that, because Q is kind of easy to accidentally press, but you can't go with V because that's bound to dodge, and you really don't want to have your dodge key out of reach. You could say maybe bind dodge to Q, but that doesn't make a lot of sense, and you might accidentally dodge as well, and you really don't want to accidentally dodge when you don't need to. Especially when you've got like a skill that has an activation time, right, and then you dodge and you interrupt yourself. Okay, you don't want to do that by accident. But it's okay if you accidentally, many times it is okay if you accidentally activate a utility skill. It's just something where you can just teleport like that, in this case. Or on my warrior, I've got a banner currently on Q. So if it's off of cooldown, I want to use it anyway. And if it's on cooldown, it's not going to activate. It's not going to do anything. So next is the elite skill, and for a long time I just had this on E. If you like to live dangerously, then you can bind yours to E as well. However, I found that very often I was accidentally activating the elite skill, and that's a problem, because sometimes, for example, Signet of Might, sometimes you, on the warrior, I'm speaking for the warrior, sometimes you need that passive adrenaline boost, and you don't really need the other buffs. And sometimes you really don't need to activate that Rampage or the Winds of Disenchantment or whatever elite skill it is. And so if I accidentally press E, nothing's going on, right? Sometimes I take my hand off of the keyboard for a second, and then I'm going back into combat, except I reposition my hand incorrectly, and now I've got my middle finger on E instead of W, and now if I press E by itself, it doesn't do anything. Instead of activating my elite skill by accident, it just doesn't do anything. Okay, so I have it as Shift E, and now in order to activate the elite skill, it has to be very, very deliberate. So that's what I've done. Boom. Do that, and then it activates. All right. So next we've got the profession skills, and this is actually the reason why I am on the... Oh, I'm bleeding. This is why I'm actually on the Necromancer, and specifically on Scourge, because the warrior doesn't really get to display how effective this is, quite like somebody that has all the way up to F5. With the profession skills, F1 and F2 on a warrior are pretty easy to reach, right? It's just kind of like you reach all the way up, and F1 is just kind of a super attack, and F2, if you're on Berserker, is just more super attacks. If you're on a Spellbreaker, it's just a defensive skill. And it doesn't get much harder than that. But sometimes with other professions, you got to make sure that you're carefully activating your profession skills, and you don't want to activate every single one off of cooldown. You want to make sure that you conserve them and conserve the cooldowns, and make sure that you're not activating them unnecessarily, because it's kind of impossible to unactivate them unnecessarily on warrior, or something else that doesn't have very many. Guardians, perhaps, with the tomes, with the firebrands, or, I don't know much about Dragon Hunter anyway. But anyways, the point is, you want to make sure that it's very deliberate, but you want to make sure that you're able to reach them. So you can't just do F1 to F5 if you want to. However, what I find to be more effective is just shift 1 through 5, because we've already established, right, 1 through 5 is pretty easy to reach. I can activate these no problem, okay? But I don't know why my 5 is not doing anything. Oh, I have to have an enemy targeted. Okay. Anyways, but shift 1 through 5 is very easy to do. Shift 1 will do that. Okay, shift 2, shift 3, shift 4, shift 5, and that's it. And I'm just activating all those things, and it's very easy to reach. It's not going to be quite as easy as just 1 through 5, but then it's going to be much easier than just F1 through F5. And so it's really important that you make those easy to reach. So what I recommend is just shift 1 through 5. And lastly, we have the special action skill. This has many times changed for me. For a while, it was shift 1. For a while, it was like shift F1, I think it was. You need this to be fairly easy to activate, because in many cases, like Fractal 25, 50, 75, and 100, the Shattered Observatory Fractal, you get a special action skill that you need to activate mid-air sometimes, and you need to make sure that you can reach it with enough time. And so what I recommend is shift tilde. It kind of just makes sense, just because it's kind of a special skill. However, if you've got any kind of free space, like if you didn't bind auto run or something like that, you could potentially do R for special action. It's really up to you. But what I've got is shift tilde. Okay. So some few quick other notes. Calling targets. I don't know what alert target is. Alert allies of the status of target. Okay. And then calling targets is just Control and T. So if I press that, I call a target. And then if you just press T, then it just swaps to that target. The other one is next enemy, and you don't need to worry about previous enemy. Just use tab to cycle through the enemies. There are no enemies here, but if there were, then it would be cycling through them. Those are pretty useful. As for the user interface stuff, it's not really stuff that you would use in combat, so you don't need to worry about it. Just you could bind those to basically whatever you want, so long as you're not going to accidentally activate them in combat. Doesn't really matter. Okay, just a couple of other things to talk about. And the next one is mounts. Okay, so the mounts are pretty useful, because you want to be able to ideally bind each mount to a hotkey, but you don't want it to be so easy to reach that, okay, so let me rephrase it. You want it to be easy to reach so that if you're in a bind and you're just trying to escape aggro, then you can like very easily mount on your raptor and just escape or something like that. Or perhaps you want to like fly down, and so you get on your griffin or whatever. And maybe you're going across some water to escape aggro, and you want to hop on your skimmer. Okay, so you want to be able to do all that kind of stuff, but at the same time, you don't want it to be so easy to mount up that you accidentally do it. It's not so much of a problem because you can't actually mount up when you're in combat, but it can be a problem potentially. So I've got mount and dismount as the decimal on the numpad, and I never change this. It's always my griffin, and the reason why is that Control and 5 is the hardest one to reach. So if I don't feel like pressing Control and 5, then I can just take my hand off the mouse for a second and just press decimal, and it will mount on the griffin. Okay, so, and then other than that, the control keys work pretty well. Control 1 through 5, it works. Remember, shift 1 through 5 is your profession skill, so if I do shift 1, it does the sand shade, and then control 1, it's going to mount on my raptor, and that, I think, works pretty well. Okay. So next we've got the abilities. So I think V kind of works pretty well for the ability 1 because you're used to it being dodge probably, and so look at that, I discovered a waypoint, Divinity's Reach. This shows you how little I play this character. But you're used to V being a movement skill, which is dodge, so it kind of makes sense because all of the skills, all of the abilities on the mounts are movement skills. They're movement based. The raptor is a jump. I just entered chat. The raptor is a jump, right? The springer is another jump, but it's a high jump. The skimmer is to what is the skimmer? It's to jump like what is it? It's to like levitate higher. And then the jackal is to teleport, and the griffin is to dive. Okay, so it makes sense because they're all movement based, that you would have something that you're used to thinking about as a movement based key. And C, I just put because it's just easier for me as the mountability 2. This only applies to the Griffin, so if you want to actually pull up after you have dove down, is that the right, dived down? I don't know the proper way to use that, but then it just makes sense for me to be able to do that. Okay, so that just makes the most sense to me. And lastly, I just wanted to talk about the interact and loot. Okay, so many people rebind this key, but I like F as interact. This is also how you're going to loot if you don't have auto loot. Now, before you have auto loot, I highly recommend binding a key to AoE loot. You may have to turn on AoE loot in the general options. Honestly, I'm not sure why they give this to us before we have auto loot, but I'm not complaining because it's a very, very useful feature. If you do not have auto loot, then I highly recommend that you bind this to a key, because if you press the regular F key, then you have to actually pull up the menu and select what you want to loot, or you can press F again and then just loot everything from that one person or that one creature. But if you press the auto loot key, it will just pull everything from the entire area all into your inventory, and so it's a very useful key. So basically, that does it for the keybinds. There are some like special, like, okay, alt commands if you're in a squad or whatever, but honestly, those are not nearly as important as your skills and your movement. So I just really wanted to talk about that. I feel like a lot of people make the noobish mistake of not setting their keybinds, and it's really, really important, because if you've got your keybinds at 6 through 0, then you're not going to be able to do some of these really difficult bosses or anything when you maybe need to. And you're not going to be able to perform as well as you could. So I hope this was helpful to many of you. Please excuse the noobishness of my necromancer itself. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to leave a like and subscribe. And definitely, if you want to become a patron, then there's a link to my Patreon down in the description below. And once again, thank you so much to Shem for being my first patron. Thank you so much for watching, everybody, and I will see you next time.